Waitress accused Barron Trump for harassment, but the CCTV footage shocked the entire courtroom. Dana had always been the kind of person who believed in hard work, but after years of waitressing at a small, nondescript cafe, she was starting to wonder if it was enough. Her shifts dragged on. The tips were barely enough to cover her rent, and with each passing day the dream of something more seemed further out of reach. She had tried applying for better jobs, but the doors kept closing. As the weeks wore on, frustration built up inside her. She was tired of scraping by, tired of seeing others around her move up while she stayed stuck. One evening, as the cafe grew quieter, Dana found herself thinking about it more seriously. There was a man who came into the cafe often, rich, successful, always surrounded by an air of importance. His name was Barron Trump. Dana didn't know much about him except that he was powerful, and powerful people could make things happen. The thought, for the first time, seemed like a way out of her endless cycle. What if she could accuse him of something that would make the headlines? The idea was dangerous, but Dana, in that moment of frustration and uncertainty, felt the temptation. What if this could be her chance to finally escape her life of endless struggle? It wasn't long before Dana's plan took shape. Every shift she watched Barron Trump from behind the counter, her mind racing. He was everything she wasn't: wealthy, influential, and seemingly untouchable. He always ordered the same thing: a cup of coffee, black, and a croissant. Nothing extraordinary, but to Dana, each of his visits became a fixation. He was so close to the life she wanted, a life she was certain she could never reach through hard work alone. Her frustrations grew, and with them, her resolve. One late evening, as the cafe grew quieter and the last few customers filed out, Dana made her decision. She had overheard enough to know Barron Trump was a frequent target of media attention. His name was always in the headlines, often in the context of scandals or high-profile events. People were fascinated by him, even if it wasn't always for the best reasons. Dana knew that a scandal, no matter how unfounded, could capture the public's eye. It could be the ticket to her escape. The thought terrified her, but at the same time it excited her in a way she couldn't explain. The next time Barron came into the cafe, Dana made sure to make her presence known. She was careful, calm, and tried to maintain a professional demeanor. But inside, her heart pounded as she found herself standing next to him. He was sitting at his usual spot, hunched over his phone, oblivious to her presence. Dana knew she had to act quickly if her plan was going to succeed. She waited until the cafe was nearly empty, and then, as she approached his table, she, accidentally, brushed against him, her hand slipping under the table just enough to be felt. It was subtle, but Dana had made sure it was noticeable enough to stir something inside Barron. He immediately looked up, confusion and surprise flashing across his face. She quickly pulled her hand back and apologized, acting flustered and embarrassed. Barron, clearly uncomfortable, muttered a half-hearted acknowledgement before quickly getting up to leave. But Dana could see it. He didn't look angry or upset, but more confused, almost as though he hadn't even realized what had happened. As Barron left, Dana's heart raced. It wasn't enough just to make the accusation. It needed to be believable, needed to feel like something that could have truly happened. She couldn't let him just leave without more. The next day, Dana made sure to dress in a way that could convey vulnerability. Her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes red, as if she had just been through an emotional experience. She spoke to a few of the regulars at the cafe, telling them how Barron had made her feel uncomfortable the night before. She hinted at the incident under the table, planting the seeds of suspicion. Before long, the gossip began to spread. Dana spoke to a few of her friends, then some of the other waitstaff. It wasn't long before a story began to take shape. Barron Trump had harassed her in the cafe, taking advantage of her position as a waitress. The details remained vague, but the accusation was clear. She never outright told anyone that Barron had physically assaulted her, but she implied it, leaving enough room for the story to snowball. The media, ever hungry for a fresh scandal, picked up the story quickly. Dana didn't have to do much after that. The headlines practically wrote themselves. "Waitress accuses Barron Trump of harassment," one paper screamed. News outlets ran with it, interviewing Dana and giving her a platform to tell her side of the story. The attention was overwhelming, but for Dana, it was intoxicating. The interviews, the cameras, the headlines, it was everything she had ever dreamed of. She was finally somebody. She had finally achieved what she had longed for: attention, recognition, and the promise of a big payout. The courtroom was a frenzy of media and spectators, all eagerly awaiting the latest chapter of the unfolding scandal. Dana had become the focal point of an intense national conversation, and every eye in the courtroom was fixed on her as she stepped up to the witness stand. Her demeanor was calm, almost too calm. She wore a neat suit, her makeup carefully applied to conceal any hint of anxiety. As she sat in the witness chair, Dana's heart beat faster than she let on, but on the surface she maintained an air of confidence. This was her moment. She had come this far, and now she would make sure the world knew Barron Trump for what she claimed he was: a predator. Barron Trump sat across from her, his posture stiff but composed. His legal team had already prepared for the worst. They had gathered evidence, witnesses, and testimonies to support his innocence, but the media storm surrounding the case was unrelenting. The accusations Dana had made were serious, and despite their foundation being weak, the public had already formed their opinions. For Barron, the trial wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about his reputation, his career, and the damage the allegations could do to his future. He stared at Dana with a mix of confusion and disbelief, still unable to fully comprehend how this had come to be. Dana's lawyer, a slick and experienced attorney with a reputation for handling high-profile cases, stood beside her. He addressed the court with confidence, his voice smooth as he painted Dana as a victim of Barron's untold actions. The defense's strategy was simple: focus on the accusation itself and present Dana as a vulnerable, hard-working woman who had fallen prey to a man with too much power. The lawyer was careful to avoid presenting direct evidence of the alleged harassment, instead opting for emotional appeals that would stir the courtroom. Dana took the stand and began her testimony. Her voice was steady, rehearsed. She described the evening of the alleged incident with precision, recalling every detail of Barron's behavior. She spoke of how he had made her feel uncomfortable with his presence, his eyes following her around the cafe as though she were beneath him. She described how, during their interaction, he had made inappropriate comments, his touch lingering longer than it should have when she accidentally bumped into him. The way she told the story was convincing, every word carefully chosen, every gesture calculated to paint Barron as the villain. She spoke of how she had been in shock, unable to properly react or speak up at the moment. It was all too much for her to handle, she claimed, and it was only after a few days of reflection that she had decided to come forward. As she spoke, Dana could feel the eyes of the room on her, judging, scrutinizing, sympathizing. She could hear the hushed gasps from the crowd, the murmurs of agreement. The case was falling into place just as she had hoped, but there was something nagging at the back of her mind, something she hadn't anticipated. She had woven a story that felt true, but in the back of her head, doubts began to creep in. She had told this lie so many times, to so many people, that it almost felt real. But deep down, she knew the truth. Barron hadn't harassed her. She had simply made it up, but the longer she stayed in the witness stand, the more her resolve hardened. She couldn't back down now. The media, the public, the court, they were all waiting for her to deliver. She had painted herself into a corner, and there was no turning back. She even went so far as to testify that Barron had attempted to make advances towards her during their interaction, despite the fact that there was no tangible evidence to support this claim. She leaned into the drama, her words carefully calculated to stir emotions. She talked about her feelings of humiliation, about how she felt as though her dignity had been stripped away in that moment. On the other side of the courtroom, Barron's defense team was quietly preparing their counterattack. They knew that Dana's accusations were flimsy at best. They had gathered statements from the cafe's other staff members, all of whom had seen nothing out of the ordinary between Dana and Barron during his visits. They had obtained security footage from the cafe that showed nothing that corroborated Dana's story. The footage revealed Barron sitting quietly, reading his phone, while Dana went about her duties as a waitress. Nothing suggestive, nothing inappropriate. The defense team also had a key witness, a fellow waiter, a young man who had been working alongside Dana during the night of the alleged incident. He testified that he had been present when Barron came into the cafe and that nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. He remembered Dana bumping into Barron, but there was no indication of harassment. The waiter had seen Dana and Barron exchange polite words, nothing more. This testimony began to chip away at the foundation of Dana's story, casting doubt on her account of what had happened. Despite the mounting evidence in Barron's favor, Dana pressed on. She continued to claim that Barron's actions had left her feeling violated and fearful. She painted a vivid picture of the emotional toll the incident had taken on her. She spoke about the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the feeling of being trapped in a world that was beyond her control. But with each word, the cracks in her story grew wider. As the trial wore on, it became clear to the jury that the case wasn't as straightforward as it had seemed at first. The emotional appeal was strong, but the evidence told a different story. Barron's legal team had managed to poke holes in Dana's narrative, casting doubt on her testimony. The media frenzy had overshadowed the facts, but in the cold, calculated environment of the courtroom, the truth was beginning to surface. News outlets ran with it, interviewing Dana and giving her a platform to tell her side of the story. The attention was overwhelming, but for Dana, it was intoxicating. The interviews, the cameras, the headlines, it was everything she had ever dreamed of. She was finally somebody. She had finally achieved what she had longed for: attention, recognition, and the promise of a big payout. The day of closing arguments arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Barron's defense team stood poised, ready to deliver their final words, while Dana's lawyer seemed to struggle to find any solid ground to stand on. Barron himself, though composed, appeared visibly exhausted from the emotional toll the trial had taken on him. The allegations had cast a shadow over his life and reputation, and now, with the truth coming to light, it seemed the scales were tipping in his favor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Barron's defense attorney began, his voice calm yet powerful. "The truth is clear, and the evidence is irrefutable. We have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that these allegations are fabricated, meant to exploit my client for monetary gain. There was no harassment, no unwanted advances. Only a woman who, after realizing the opportunity, chose to lie." Dana's lawyer, who had previously been confident, looked uneasy as he stood up to counter. But the victim has spoken," he argued, his voice rising slightly in desperation. "She is the one who has endured this harassment, this humiliation. Her pain is real." "Pain? I see no evidence of pain," Barron's lawyer responded coolly, his gaze unwavering as he turned to the jury. "Instead, we see a woman who has concocted a story to manipulate you. The video footage, the testimonies, everything proves that my client's actions were entirely appropriate. There was no harassment, only a fabricated accusation." The defense lawyer paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room before continuing. "Dana Reed, the plaintiff in this case, has shown us that she will do anything to get what she wants, no matter the cost. And that includes lying, twisting the truth, and damaging the reputation of an innocent man. I ask you to consider the evidence we've presented and render your verdict based on the truth, not on emotion or fabricated claims." The courtroom was silent. The jury exchanged looks, some nodding as they processed what they had heard. Even the prosecutor seemed conflicted, glancing briefly at Dana as if searching for any shred of credibility in her story. Barron, seated beside his legal team, glanced briefly at Dana. His face was a mask of calm, but inside the battle raged. He had seen the toll the trial had taken on him. His name dragged through the mud, his character called into question by the very woman who had lied. He had always known the truth, but now it seemed that truth was finally breaking through. Dana's lawyer turned to her, his voice a low murmur. "This isn't going well. We need something, anything, more to make this stick." Dana shook her head, her face pale. "I can't lose this. I need this," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "I've come too far." As Barron's defense attorney made his closing remarks, Dana stood abruptly, her voice trembling as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her tone desperate. "I am the victim here. What Barron Trump did to me, it destroyed my life. I had no choice but to act. I had to protect myself." Her words hung in the air, but instead of evoking sympathy, they seemed to backfire. Barron's lawyer didn't miss a beat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he interjected, "we've heard enough. Dana Reed is not a victim. She is a perpetrator of deceit. She's attempted to ruin a man's life for personal gain." Dana's eyes widened as the defense lawyer's words struck her like a slap. She took a step back, realizing that her final attempt to sway the jury had only exposed her weakness. The prosecutor looked down at his notes, unable to formulate a response. The judge, however, turned his gaze to Dana, his expression a mix of exasperation and disbelief. "Ms. Reed," the judge said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You've had your chance to speak. Your testimony has been heard. I suggest you sit down and let the jury deliberate." For a moment, Dana hesitated, her eyes darting between the judge and the jury. The courtroom was heavy with the weight of her failure. She slowly sank into her seat, the last shred of hope slipping away as she realized that her lies were no longer holding up. Barron's defense attorney gave a final, resolute statement. "The truth is on our side. We stand with justice, and justice will prevail." The room fell silent once again as the jury prepared to deliberate. The evidence had been laid bare. The lies had been exposed. And now, all that was left was the verdict. The following days after the closing arguments were filled with suspense as the jury went into deliberation. Barron spent those days quietly with his family, trying to hold on to a sense of normalcy, despite the storm swirling around him. The media coverage, though quieter now, still had a presence. Every so often, Barron would hear a headline that tried to sensationalize the case in one direction or another, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the legal team that had been so dedicated to defending him. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The jury deliberated for hours, each member weighing the evidence carefully. Barron's legal team was confident, but they knew better than to take anything for granted. After all, this was a high-profile case, and emotions could run high. Dana, who had been seated quietly during this time, watched the jury closely, her face a mask of tension. Despite the mounting evidence against her, she still held on to the hope that somehow she could convince the jury to side with her. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. Everyone stood as the foreman approached the judge with the verdict in hand. The tension was palpable, and even the judge seemed to be bracing for the outcome. Barron's heart pounded in his chest, but he remained still, trying to maintain his composure. Dana, on the other hand, looked as though she was holding her breath, waiting for the news that could either vindicate her or destroy her. The judge unsealed the verdict, his eyes scanning the paper as he addressed the room. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Barron Trump, not guilty of all charges," he said, his voice steady. A collective exhale filled the room, as if the weight of the last few weeks had finally been lifted. Barron's legal team erupted into quiet cheers, while Barron himself sat still for a moment, absorbing the news. It wasn't just a win in the courtroom. It was a victory for his name, his reputation, and his family. He stood slowly, his face showing no emotion, but inside, a profound sense of relief washed over him. Dana, on the other hand, looked as though she had been struck by a bolt of lightning. Her face turned pale, her eyes wide in disbelief. The truth had been exposed, and now the consequences were about to fall on her. Barron's team knew the verdict didn't end things here. The public scrutiny of Dana's actions would continue, and the case would likely have long-lasting repercussions for her. "Ms. Reed," the judge continued, addressing Dana directly, "you have been found guilty of attempting to deceive this court with false accusations. You have wasted the court's time, and you have attempted to harm an innocent man. Your actions have consequences." Dana stood there for a moment, trembling. The guilt was clear in her expression, though she refused to look Barron in the eye. She had played her hand, and now it was time to face the consequences. Dana's lawyer was already whispering into her ear, trying to offer her some semblance of comfort, but it was clear that nothing could undo the damage that had been done. "I will be sentencing you shortly," the judge said before turning to Barron. "Mr. Trump, you are free to go. You have been exonerated, and the charges against you have been dismissed." Barron nodded, his face still impassive as he walked out of the courtroom with his legal team. His family was waiting for him outside, and they embraced him tightly, relieved that this chapter of their lives was finally over. But Dana's journey was far from over. The legal system would now turn its attention to the false accusations she had made, and the consequences would be severe. The media, which had once sensationalized her claims, now turned on her, questioning her motives and reporting on the upcoming legal battles she would face for defamation and perjury. Her life, once filled with promises of financial gain and fame, had now crumbled before her eyes. As Barron and his family made their way home, the weight of the trial still hung in the air. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about the emotional toll that the whole ordeal had taken. He had learned that sometimes even the truth wasn't enough to stop lies from spreading, but he had fought back with dignity and patience, and in the end, justice had prevailed. It was clear to Barron that, despite the courtroom victory, there was a long road ahead for him to fully recover from the damage caused by the false accusations. He would continue to rebuild his reputation, but at least now he could do so knowing that the truth was on his side. If you want stories like this, subscribe Storyboat for daily upcoming stories.